Tragically, prejudice can often culminate in the final stage, which is outright genocide or extermination. I've gone from making jokes about individuals who wear jeans to deciding that all individuals who wear jeans must be exterminated, that I must eliminate anyone who wears jeans in this classroom. Most of us have a difficult time fathoming or grasping how jokes or disparaging comments could slowly escalate into outright extermination or genocide, but scholars like myself could cite countless illustrations and examples where that is exactly what has happened, where comments, disparaging comments and remarks have slowly escalated to acts of violence and outright extermination altogether. Obviously, sane, rational, civilized people like ourselves wish to avoid such a horrid fate gripping our population. From my standpoint, the only way to curb and to counter prejudice and its corollary discrimination are to try to ascertain and understand the underlying forces that can give rise to prejudice and discrimination, trying to understand the various causes. And the causes are many in number, so many, in fact, that we can't even possibly encompass or address them all in the limited amount of time that we have here. But in the textbook that I'm preparing, there are a number of critical underlying causes of prejudice that I cite, that I think are particularly important in our modern day and age. We obviously are facing some dire economic times in the present-day United States and in other parts of the industrialized world. One of my concerns is that these dire economic times could give rise to increased prejudice and ultimately to greater violence in the modern-day United States. Why do I say that? Well, in times past, frustration has given rise to a good deal of aggression in industrialized countries like ours. This is one possible cause of prejudice and discrimination, the so-called frustration-aggression hypothesis. A person has a lot of turmoil in their personal life. They can't pay the PICO bill, they can't pay Comcast, their wife just ran off with another man, the car broke down, the frustration is building up, they lose their job. They're frustrated, they're angry. A lot of innocent people decide to vent their frustration in the form of aggression, often aimed at outsiders, at people they perceive as being a member of an outgroup, a population other than their own. I cited this example in the classroom before, that at one time I was in a restaurant, an awful restaurant as it turns out, and there was a gentleman sitting at a bar, a rather unattractive fellow to say the least, quite hideous, but at any rate, he was at the counter denouncing illegal immigrants, arguing that these blankety-blank Mexicans were coming here, taking all the jobs away from people. I'm sick and tired of these people. We should just get rid of them all, expel them from the United States. He went on for roughly a half an hour as I was waiting for my hamburger, saying, please hurry this up so I don't listen to this drivel any longer. Eventually, I grew weary of this unattractive gentleman's tirade, and I walked over to him and said, sir, I think you're a victim of frustration aggression. As he sat there looking at me totally bewildered, who is Steve Urkel to come up here and tell me this stuff? But at any rate, I said to him, sir, you don't harbor any ill will towards illegal immigrants. What's really going on here is you can't pay the PICO bill, your bills are mounting, you've got credit card debt up to the ceiling, your wife is unhappy with you because you're watching ESPN 24 hours a day and not satisfying her, etc., etc. And that's why you're venting all this frustration. I was startled when the young man erupted into tears. I apparently had hit a nerve. I apparently had hit the nail on the head, so to speak, that in fact that was why he was ranting and ranting about illegal immigration and about the staggering number of Latinos in the United States. It wasn't because he genuinely harbored such hostility. He was simply venting frustration, the frustration that had built up in his personal life. What is so ominous about the frustration-aggression hypothesis is, again, there are a lot of frustrated people in our present-day society. We must all be watchful for this particular phenomenon. We must all be on guard that we keep our frustrations, our personal anxieties and concerns in check. and that we not allow them to spiral out of control so that they lead us to behave in ways that we never imagined possible. This is what happened in Weimar Germany in the 1920s, in the decade prior to Adolf Hitler coming to power. Many German war veterans were disgruntled and angry because they couldn't find employment. They couldn't find jobs. Germany had lost the war. The country was a mess. They were angry and frustrated, and they were looking for scapegoats. They were looking for anyone to blame. And they found scapegoats in the form of Jews, communists, social democrats, and others they believed had stabbed them in the back. I fear that we could have a similar phenomenon in the modern-day United States if economic conditions do not improve, and if our political leaders do not do more to try to ease our anxieties, concerns, frustrations, etc., etc. Right now, we are sorely lacking in the kind of political leadership that I think is needed. But frustration aggression is just one of many hypotheses and theories I could cite to explain the phenomenon of prejudice. Something I often talk about in the classroom is an innate human tendency that all of us have, whether we recognize it or not. That is the tendency towards categorical thinking. All human beings, regardless of their background, function with the aid of different categories. The human mind has to function with the aid of categories. I have to have a separate category for door and a separate category for a chair. Otherwise, I'll be opening the chair and trying to sit my behind on the door, which obviously would be a rather disturbing phenomenon. We have separate categories for things that enable us to function as human beings. Categorical thinking is essential for our survival. At the same time, categorical thinking can pose problems for everyday people because we also have a tendency to put human beings into categories. We have a tendency to lump people into categories without necessarily thinking or recognizing that we have this tendency. Even an educator like myself will have a tendency to lump certain students into categories. These are the exceptional students, these are the imbeciles, etc., etc. Lumping people into categories that may be unfounded, that there may be no basis for whatsoever. Categories that may be based on stereotypes and broad generalizations, and not necessarily based in empirical reality or empirical fact. Why this innate human tendency towards categories and categorical thinking? Why do we engage in this particular tendency or succumb to this tendency? Well, part of it has to do with intellectual laziness. It's far easier for me to lump students into categories than it is to get to know each and every one of you individually. Obviously, that would be a very difficult and overwhelming task for me to befriend every single student in the classroom. Categorical thinking often is a form of laziness. We put people into categories because it's easy. It's easier than getting to know people in depth. It's easier than getting to know every single individual that you encounter. Categorical thinking frequently leads to prejudice, because once you start putting people in categories, good or bad, prejudice and discrimination pretty much are inevitable and unavoidable. What is so fascinating is that all human beings have this tendency towards categorical thinking, but most of us are not even conscious of it. Most of us engage in this practice without even realizing that we have succumbed to it. Categorical thinking is just one of many psychological tendencies or psychological problems we have that can give rise to prejudice. Here's another that I often mention in the classes that I instruct here at the university. Psychological projection. Psychological projection is another phenomenon that all human beings are vulnerable to, whether we realize it or not. My wife is standing over here filming this event here. Let me use her as an example, as I often do in the classroom. An example of psychological projection that I often mention in class. Suppose, for whatever reason, I just decide or succumb to some kind of deep-seated horny tendencies. I woke up one morning and said to myself, my God, I just want to copulate with everybody, for whatever reason. No legitimate reason whatsoever. I just have urges I cannot control. I have no idea where these urges are coming from, but I know what they're bad. They're illicit. I know I can't succumb to these tendencies, so I try my best to suppress them. Obviously, I don't want to get a social disease, so I must not copulate with everyone, so I control myself. But a lot of times what happens when we have deep-seated desires that we can't fulfill is that we project those desires onto other people. We don't want these desires lingering within us, so we project them onto other parties. So my poor wife comes home one day, and I ask her, where have you been? And she says, oh, I've just been out. And I said, no, you haven't. You've been out with 20 men, that's where you've been. My own innate desires, I've just projected onto her. My own desire for promiscuity, I've just projected onto an innocent party. This often happens with regard to prejudice. A lot of times, people voice adverse criticisms of other groups and other people that are really apt criticisms of them. Members of one population will accuse another population of being, you're all a bunch of thieves, you're diseased, you procreate like rabbits, etc., etc. That could be an example of psychological projection. These desires, feelings, faults, etc., etc., being projected onto other people. One population accuses another of being lazy, weak, ignorant, ill-educated, when in fact it is they who feel this way about themselves. A lot of us project our deep-seated fears, anxieties, and emotions onto vulnerable parties without even recognizing that we are doing so. Psychological projection, I fear, is a widespread phenomenon in the modern-day United States, and it is another tendency that most of us are not even aware exists. Most of us don't even recognize that human beings have this tendency. So many others I could mention. In my classes and in my book, I talk about what is called outgroup homogeneity. Outgroup homogeneity, a big, highfalutin, egghead term for a really simple tendency. What is outgroup homogeneity? Well, it's a tendency to see members, all the members of a particular group, as all being the same. A tendency to see the members of one group as all having the same attributes. So, as a college professor, I may say to myself, you know something, all college students are dunderheads, they all get mediocre grades, they're all late for class, they all get intoxicated on Thursday nights, etc., etc. Just lump you all into one big category and generalize about all of you. Why? Why would a college professor do this? Why would I see all members of a population as being the same, while seeing my own population, my own group, as being unique? Well, once again, outgroup homogeneity may have something to do with intellectual laziness. Perhaps I simply don't want to get to know all of my students very well. It also may have to do with limited contact and communication. Obviously, I don't live in your dormitories, in your apartments with you. I don't have a lot of interaction with students outside of the classroom, so I'm not particularly familiar with all of you. Clearly, most of you would be disturbed if you awakened in your dormitory and I was sitting right there. Professor Clyburn, what are you doing here? You obviously would find that very, very troublesome indeed. I'm sure my spouse would too. At any rate, clearly, I don't have a lot of contact with undergraduates outside of the classroom, so I may begin to generalize and stereotype about all of you because of the limited communication and the limited contact that I have been exposed to. This, of course, is precisely why so many theorists and scholars have suggested that prejudice can be reduced by increased contact, by increased communication. Of course, as I always caution and always warn, it is also possible, in some cases, that increased contact and communication could make matters worse. It is possible I could live in your dormitories with you guys, and after a couple of days end up with an even lower opinion of all of you than I had to begin with. It is possible that the more exposure I got to all of you, the more that my opinion could worsen, and vice versa. It is possible the more time you guys spend at my home, the more detestable or offensive you might find my conduct or my behavior. So increased contact, in all likelihood, will improve the situation, but it isn't necessarily a cure-all or a panacea. It isn't necessarily going to eliminate prejudice altogether.